for questions and discussion. So this WiCDS Wednesday, as Jamie mentioned, is a launch of the book Intimacy and Injury in the wake of Me Too in India and South Africa. It was published by Manchester University Press and edited by Profs Nicky Falkof, Cyrilla Roy, and Shilpa Phadke. So just a bit of a description for those who haven't had a chance to read the book as yet. So both India and South Africa have shared the infamy of being labeled the world's rape capitals, with high levels of everyday gender-based and sexual violence. At the same time, both boast long histories of resisting such violence and its location in wider cultures of patriarchy, settler colonialism, and class and caste privilege. Through the lens of the Me Too moment, the book tracks histories of feminist organizing in both countries, while also revealing how newer strategies extended or limited these struggles. Intimacy and Injury is a timely mapping of a shifting political field around gender-based violence in the global South. In proposing comparative, interdisciplinary, ethnographically rich, and analytically astute reflections on Me Too, it provides new and potentially transformative directions to scholarly debates. This book builds transnational feminist knowledge and solidarity in and across the global South. So through this dialogue and discussion, we hope, and we certainly know that we'll have very fruitful conversation, a safe space for building feminist and queer solidarity, resistance, movement work, and a vision for a patriarchy-free future. So I'm going to begin by introducing everybody to the co-editors and contributors, Prof. Shilpa Phadke and Prof. Nicky Falkof, who will be speaking about the genesis of the book and the editorial process respectively. And later I'll move on to speak to introduce contributors Jamil F. Khan and Nechama Brodie, who will speak about their chapters and their experiences in the writing process. So to begin, Prof. Shilpa Phadke, her pronouns are she, her. She hails from the School of Media and Cultural Studies at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Her book chapters are in the introduction, which is Intimacy, Injury, and Me Too in India and South Africa, and Rebuilding Precarious Solidarities, a Feminist Debate in Internet Time. She is also the co-author of the critically acclaimed book, Why Loiter? Women and Risk on Mumbai Streets, and co-director of the 2016 documentary film Under the Open Sky. She has published both academically and in mainstream media in the areas of gender and public space, ethnographies of feminism, feminist pedagogy, risk and the city, middle-class sexualities, middle classes in the new spaces of consumption, feminist pedagogies, and feminist parenting. Prof. Nicky Falkof, her pronouns are she, her. She is from the Department of Media Studies at WiCDS, and her book chapter is the introduction, which is co-written with Cyrilla Roy and Shilpa. And Nicky Falkof is, her research centers on race and anxiety in the urban global South, with primary focus on South Africa. She's the author of the 2022 book, Warrior State, Risk, Anxiety, and Moral Panic in South Africa, and The End of Whiteness, Satanism, and Family Murder in the Late Apartheid. She's a co-editor of Intimacy and Injury and Anxious Joburg, The Inner Lives of a Global South City. So yeah, I would like to hand over to Prof. Phadke and of course invite Prof. Falkof to, get involved at any point. Yeah, so please get us into today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Uvania, and thank you, Jamie and WiCDS, for inviting us. We're really, really excited and delighted to be here. Am I audible? Thank you. Okay, excellent. So I'll do a very brief introduction to the genesis of the book that began in a workshop that we held at WITS, and then hand over to Nicky. So as hashtag #MeToo was snaking its way across the globe, making ripples or sometimes waves in different countries, I received an invitation from Srila Roy, who's sadly unable to be here today, to collaborate on a workshop looking at this phenomenon in India and South Africa. By this time, it was already becoming clear that this very public social media-led conversation on sexual harassment was assuming different shapes and forms in different contexts and at different times, even within the same context. As Uvania just said, India and South Africa, both countries notorious for sexual violence against women, but also, interestingly, both countries known for a vibrant public discourse on social justice. So what might it mean, we wonder, to bring these contexts into conversation with one another in relation to Me Too? And so it was that we began a conversation on workshopping with hashtag #MeToo in 2019. One of the things we agreed on was that we should try to bring together scholars who were at the time working in one of the two countries to facilitate a particular kind of focused dialogue, and to think in a very sort of organic, intimate, grounded way about these two countries and what was happening in them. This was for us a very exciting exercise that also led one to read a great deal in relation to the kind of writing and scholarship that was already emerging around Me Too, and to think of how the workshop might productively engage with the existing work as well as contributing to it. Shrila's Global South project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, governing intimacies, provided a deeply generative context for this work and grounded our conversations around the question of both questions of gender, feminism, but also located within the Global South. The workshop created the space to ask some difficult questions, which then made their way into the volume in various ways. Hashtag #MeToo was, in various countries and contexts, creating complex and often challenging conversations within our feminisms as well. It was asking sometimes unanswerable questions in relation to movements for social justice, including of feminisms themselves. I like to think that the contributions to the volume sit with these challenges and difficulties, thinking through them without necessarily claiming to have answers. That the papers are able to center the layered hierarchies, even when they, or perhaps especially when they point fingers at our feminisms themselves, are perhaps the most compelling testimony of our capacity to engage. Speaking for myself, the workshop provided a space for me to explore something that I had been sitting with a while. The distrust and the distance that had been created between feminists within the Indian Academy in the wake of a Me Too that took place in October 2017 that addressed sexual harassment by Indian men academics both within and outside the country. The fallout of this centered attention on feminist relationships with accusations, disappointment, and disillusionment on all sides. The workshop, taking place as it did in Johannesburg, where there wasn't a very large group of sort of Indian feminist scholars there, provided distance and space and time from that moment and allowed a space for me to articulate the beginnings of a conversation around that moment. In this volume, again, the papers speak to each other, they speak around each other, and they speak with each other. They engage university spaces, they talk of big headline cases and what those meant for our understanding of sexual violence, in what ways they were or were not connected to each other in terms of their context in India and South Africa. They engage different spaces and institutions, in one case challenging the state, in another reflecting on the rural. They also engage with the personal and what it has meant to navigate the political of hashtag #MeToo. They remind us that Me Too does not exist in a vacuum, but is located within decades of work, within decades of scholarship and activism. They remind us of the fissures within our feminisms and what these have meant for the capacity to call out our sexual harassment and violence. They reflect on what Me Too might mean in queer contexts. They point to the silences within #MeToo's, articulating the layered privileges of speech, even in this context. They engage the law, media, and theatre, among others. Do India and South Africa talk to each other in this volume? In many cases, they do. When read together, these papers offer an engagement with what it might mean for us to have a conversation with each other in ways that do not need to engage North America or Western Europe. The workshop and this volume bear testimony to the richness of dialogue that emerges in engaging with each other. These contexts are not the same, or sometimes not even similar, but the conversations we had were wide-ranging and diverse. The conversations were often not really about comparison at all. The volume contributes to our understanding of how Me Too has unfolded in India and South Africa and perhaps elsewhere too. When we say South-South dialogue, we're centering a particular geopolitics of knowledge production. But beyond that, what this conversation between India and South Africa that traverses our feminisms and so many other isms in relation to #MeToo does is open up possibilities of more such exchanges, not simply because it is politically appositive, but also because it is deeply generative and wildly exciting. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Nicky, and we can go back and forth.
Thank you, Shilpa. Is my sound okay? Yes? Okay. I'm just going to switch I'm just going to switch a timer on because I'd like to keep what I'm saying comparatively short, and I haven't written anything formal. I think the most important contributions today are coming from the contributors, from Nechama and Jamil. So I want to leave space for them to really have a chance to speak properly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk briefly about some of the editorial choices behind this book, and then I'm going to talk briefly about publishing the book itself. So I was not actually part of the original workshop. I wandered down from my office on one of the days to take part because Srila had invited me. I found it astonishing and incredibly interesting and incredibly generative. And then from there became involved in discussions around the possible editorial processes of a book. So I haven't actually contributed a chapter to this book, which is quite unusual for me as an editor. You know, I tend to want to have something specific to say in my own work. And in this instance, it didn't happen. So I approached the book completely differently, solely as an editor. And that was a very interesting and comparatively challenging experience in multiple ways. One of the things that we did as editors, once the three of us got together and decided this book was going to happen, is we spent a long time thinking about how we would make it work. And obviously most of the contributions developed from the workshop that Shilpa was just discussing, but some of them didn't. In some instances, we approached people. We looked at possible lacunas in the conversation. We looked at things that were missing, things that felt noticeably absent, tried to find people to fill those gaps, which of course does not mean that all gaps were filled. There are always going to be a number of noticeable gaps in any edited volume. But we tried really hard to say what desperately needs to be in this conversation, or who desperately needs to be in this conversation, and where do we get them? And another way in which we did that was, you know, we approached people like Jamil, who will speak later, and asked them to write shorter, more accessible, less scholarly pieces. So the book is comprised of some academic work, some work that comes from activists, some work that comes from journalists, some work that comes from people who write across different fields. But in this instance, we're writing much more personal, much more accessible reflections. And the motivation for this was to try and make a book that would be readable, that would go from the extremely challenging, extremely complex discussions of theory to the deeply personal, deeply affecting, challenging in other ways, discussions of experience. And, you know, thinking about why we did this, there are always going to be limits to scholarly work, right? There are always limits to what academic work can achieve. And a big part of these limits is, you know, who's reading this? Who's it written for? Is it written for normal people, or is it written for people who have doctorates? And one of the things that we really wanted to do was to create a book that would be legible to ordinary people. There are some chapters that are extremely intellectually challenging, although those are also accessible in their own ways. And there are some chapters that take a completely different register and don't present themselves within that scholarly discourse. And, you know, we're hoping that in doing this, we've kind of taken, I guess, what you could think of as a feminist editorial line where we want the work to be broadly accessible. And I'll come back to the problems of making broader access work in a minute. So yeah, we have varied contributors, we have varied types of work, we have varied types of chapters, and hopefully that does make for a book that is not inaccessible, a book that is not elitist, a book that may, we hope, be useful and valuable, not just to scholars working on gender-based violence, but also to activists and also to ordinary people who live with this truth every day in India and South Africa. Speaking and thinking about the accessibility of the book and who can read it and how, I think it is important to publicly acknowledge the huge complexities of publishing. This book was originally conceptualized as a co-publication between a female-headed independent press in India and a female-headed independent press in South Africa. Then COVID hit. We all know that the South African book market is in crisis. I mean, if you sell 200 books, you are absolutely a bestseller at the moment in South Africa. It's a very dire situation. And so our South African publisher basically said, look, sorry, we can't take a punt on this book. This was at the beginning. The book had already been in process. People had been writing. It was the beginning of the pandemic. And our South African publisher said, we cannot risk publishing an edited volume on something as niche as Me Too, which of course is not that niche, but nonetheless. And so we found ourselves without a publisher. Now, Srila and I at this point had already set up a book series with Manchester University Press, which, by the way, just to quickly pitch it, is called Governing Intimacies in the Global South. It's based out of the project which this workshop and this book eventually came from. We are interested in proposals. We are interested in proposals about work, for work about South Africa. If you may be interested in proposing a book, please pop me an email. So that's just off the topic. But so we took the book to Manchester UP and they loved it. And they said, yes, we want it. And we were like, great, we've got a publisher. And since then, we then found ourselves in the position where we had a publisher, a strong publisher, a publisher that was very, very supportive of the project, but also a publisher that charges 80 British pounds for a hard copy of this book and may print a soft cover in a few years. We don't know, it's not confirmed. So we've been hustling and fighting and arguing and missioning to try and find local co-publications. The book will now be published in paperback in India by Zuban Publishers, which we are thrilled about because they are really, really influential feminist press. And we are very hopeful that we now have a local South African co-publication in place as well. So there will be a paperback available here. Before this panel actually formally began, some of the contributors and Shilpa, who's one of the editors, people were saying, where are our copies, right? People have not received copies of the book that they contributed to. And this is because, according to Manchester University Press, their distributors are struggling because of Brexit. So, you know, you're in this situation where you do this work, you write this work, you support this work, you make this work that you think is important and significant. And then there's Brexit. And then there's a pandemic. And these things impact on your ability not just to get the work published, but to physically get the book into people's hands. This is, I think, something that we don't talk about enough publicly and openly as scholars. What is the value of the work that we are doing if it only exists in an 80-pound hardback that can only be bought by libraries in Europe, right? And of course, you know, particularly within this context, many of us are scholars, many of us are academics, many of us need to publish in this way in order to sustain our careers, in order to get tenure, in order to get promotion, in order to feel secure, in order to, you know, be financially stable enough that we can have families. This is something else we were talking about at the start of this panel, you know, that there are feminist considerations to the necessity of doing this kind of work. But nonetheless, if the work is not available, how much does it then mean? And this, I think, is something that we as feminist scholars, as anti-racist scholars, as critical diversity scholars need to be dealing with and thinking about constantly. Are there ways to disseminate our work that makes it more available? Are there things that we can do, especially those of us who find ourselves in the more privileged position of now having sustainable careers, of now having tenure or whatever the equivalent is? So yeah, overall, I mean, as I said, I didn't contribute a chapter to the book. For me as an editor, it was a hugely generative and hugely challenging experience, trying to support contributors who were facing all sorts of challenges during COVID. You know, we all know how heavily the consequences of the pandemic weighed on those who do care work for families, and how often the people who do that kind of work are women. And this was a volume full of contributions by women and queer people who were under enormous amounts of social and familial pressure during the pandemic. How do you do this labor in a way that both allows the important work to get made, get written, and be accessible, but is also empathetic and takes the feminist perspective that we do have families, we do parent, we do love, we do care, we do all of these multiple forms of intimacy in our daily lives. And these things intersect with our scholarship. They are not separate. We do not all have wives who stay home and look after our homes for us so that we can sit in our offices in our lovely ivory towers and write our books and then, you know, thank everyone for their support when they come up. That is just not how scholarship works for the people who are interested in these conversations and contribute to these kinds of books. So overall, you know, when putting intimacy and injury together, I think the contributions, of course, are the most important part of this book. And, you know, both of the people who are going to speak to you now have done amazing, beautiful work in this book that we are very, very proud to publish. But the process of putting the book together is in itself, in multiple ways, a feminist act. And as scholars, this is something that I think we need to consistently consider. How is my practice as an editor? How is my practice as a publisher? How is my practice as a teacher? How is my practice as a facilitator coherent with the politics that I claim to espouse in my research? I think that's it from me.
Shilpa, is there anything else you would like to say before we move forward?
No, like Nicky was saying, we really want to hear from Nechama and Jamil. So,
okay.
Yeah, we want to keep space.
Thanks so much to the both of you for really giving us a good understanding of the background and what has informed your approaches, and also insight into the complexity around publishing and the ivory tower of academia and ivory tower of publishing that makes a lot of work inaccessible. I think one thing I noted with this book is that the writing is so accessible as well. And that's a problem we see a lot in scholarship, is that it's exclusionary to so many people. So I think there's a lot of conversations around accessibility that are useful here. I just wanted to extend a note from Mamzanele Mbeki. She was in the room. Unfortunately, she has connectivity issues, and she wanted to send her apologies for not being able to participate. So I would like to move on to introducing Dr. Nechama Brodie and Jamil F. Khan. Dr. Brodie's pronouns are she, her. She's a lecturer at the Wits Center for Journalism and acting coordinator of the Wits Justice Project. Her book chapter is South Africa's Own Delhi Moment, news coverage of the murders of Jyothi Singh and Anen Boyson. So she's a Joburg-based journalist and the author of 9 books, including the monograph Femicide in South Africa. She teaches at the Wits Center for Journalism and is currently, as I said, the acting coordinator of the Wits Justice Project. Her academic research focuses on collecting and curating data about fatal violence in the global South. And then, you know, I think actually I'm gonna wait to introduce Jamil after Dr. Brodie speaks, so that it's coherent about, and we remember who our speakers are just before they share their content. So over to you.
Thank you very much. And I think no one will mistake me for Jamil simply because our hair is exceptionally different. I mean, if you look, you know, but listening to sort of the introductory talks, I loved what Shilpa said about the origin of this book. And it was a reminder of the absolute power of collaboration. And within an academic space, there's always a challenge when you have to write as an academic. Should you be writing on your own, or should you be working with others? And this process, in fact, working with what was initially Governing Intimacies, which funded my PhD research, and then was part of these workshops that we had in Johannesburg, later in Delhi as well, were really highlighted for me the importance of meeting other female scholars and feminist scholars and queer scholars from the global south, because our formative years as academics are so strongly based in, well, I mean, boring old shit from the north, right? So, and some of it's not boring, some of it's relevant. There's a lot of relevance to, the stuff I even make my students read. But it honestly was like the light in my head went on for the first time when I sat in a room with the scholars that were part of what, most of them are actually present in this book or involved in some way. It was like finding a home in a really strange and exciting way. And I think that the book reflects that. So for people who are going to be reading it, is to understand that despite navigating some odd and often very uncomfortable and discomforting spaces, that the people who have created the words that go into this book are a home for each other. And I think that comes across very strongly listening to both Nicky and to Shilpa as well. And I think, again, that if you look at my opening chapter and Jamil's closing chapter as the top and the tail of this book, how they represent very different ways to approach, it's not the same topic, but it's the same school of things that we need to be talking about, and how important it is that we as scholars and as thinkers are able to integrate not just data and not just narrative, but actually understand that they do intersect with each other. And that when we talk about ideas of sort of intersectionality, it goes beyond sort of how we conceptualize it, even from a feminist perspective or a gender perspective or a race perspective. That as scholars, when we want to decolonize approaches, that is what it involves, is we want to reformat the way we structure knowledge. And I remember presenting the foundation of my chapter in Delhi, and everyone's kind of like, oh, she has graphs. We're not sure what this person who has graphs is doing here, because I had like this diagram of media coverage. And then everyone was like, oh, wow, that was actually a really cool graph. So thank you. And to explain what I talk about in my chapter is my research really looks at how people are killed. I don't always look so much at why people are killed, or that comes into it in part. And one of the structures that I use to try and build information around this, because my background is as a journalist and as a writer, is I look at news archives. And when I say archive, I mean anything from yesterday to 100 years ago. So anything that sort of has already been printed. And the reason why I enjoy that, and I think it has a lot of validity as a scholar and as a journalist, is we know that news stories don't always tell us exactly what's happening in reality. But what they do tell us is how society at that time perceives reality, or how sections of society perceive reality. So when we look at old newspapers, from 20, 30, 40 years ago, different types of newspapers will have different types of narratives while sharing the same information. And that can be very valuable too. That tells us who society values as a victim, the types of crimes that society fears, and also how they describe and narrate those crimes. And it's important to understand that these narrations and the words that we use can change over time and can change by country. For example, if you were reading media in Kenya, they wouldn't use the word rape to describe that type of sexual assault of a woman. They would use the word defilement. And we know that in South Africa, for example, the legal construct of rape within marriage didn't exist until the 1990s, because before that time, well, if a husband couldn't rape his wife because she was expected to, So understand that even things that we think of now as being fixed constructs from where we are not necessarily fixed, and they change over time. What was always interesting for me when I was doing my doctoral research on the murder of women was to try and understand what were the kind of factors that might increase or decrease the amount of media coverage different stories got. Why do some victims attract huge headlines and others don't? Why do some stories catch the world's imagination and others don't? And as it turned out, there was a very strong connection already, quite explicit, between South Africa and India at that time. And looking through, and so what I did was actually documented all different news stories and saw how many news stories were published at different times. So I did lots of graphing and numbers, but which some of which are mentioned in the chapter. But what became evident was that the rape and murder of Josie Singh at the end of 2012, in December 2012, which I note is still referred to as the Delhi gang rape. And this is, for me, quite important because this relates very strongly to a major South African story that's happening right now, which was about a gang rape of multiple women, not far from Johannesburg, but in the West Rand. And how I think in South Africa and India, in both societies, rape is often conceptualized as something that is worse than death. So when we talk about the murder of Jyoti Singh, we don't talk about her murder, it's her rape instead. And that also speaks to how we construct violence against women in our societal narratives and in our media narratives. So we're already told that it is worse to be raped than to die. So we should choose as women which one we're happy to or content to suffer. But what happened was that story did catch the world's imagination, and this really in the sequence of the book stands as a sort of a precursor to later what becomes formalized as Me Too. Which is, how does a movement become a movement? What are the mechanics of that? And in part, it comes from, the structural issues around language, which is metaphor and framing. And what happened was the events that took place in Delhi in December 2012 became a frame through which South Africa was then able to review its own absolutely terrible sexual violence, including rape and murder. And what I could immediately track was that the coverage of what happened in Delhi, which I can tell you the first day that it got covered in the South African press and how it got picked up. And over time, there was sort of increasing coverage, especially when Nirbhaya died, and then sort of coverage started to tail off. And what happened after that was a few weeks later, after her death, and a woman in South Africa was raped and murdered in a very small town called Brodie, and her name was Anine Boyson. And Anine, by all other metrics, would never have been the recipient of mass media coverage because she was a poor and uneducated brown woman in a small town. She had been out drinking at a tavern, and as it turns out, her rape and murder were the second most covered femicide of that whole year, and second to the murder of Reeva Steenkamp, who people would know as a former, what was a model and a legal graduate, and was involved with a prominent sports star who murdered her at the time of her death. And her Reeva Steenkamp's death obviously made international headlines and was the single most covered femicide in that year. In fact, Reeva Steenkamp's killing on its own got more media coverage than every single other femicide that took place in South Africa that year combined. Just to contextualize how much media coverage Reeva Steenkamp's death got. But the second most covered femicide between 2012 and 2013, so it was Anine Boyson. I use that year because the police reporting year isn't a calendar year. It's a bit odd. And I tried to understand why. What were the factors that suddenly propelled this otherwise, and sad to say, unexceptional or unremarkable in the South African framework, death into such a large spotlight? And it turned out that there was a direct link with what had happened in Delhi. Is that in the few days after Anine Boyson's death was reported in the press, garnering just a few small sentences, a prominent trade unionist had said that this should be South Africa's Delhi moment. That this rape and murder, which had some minor similarities to what had happened in Delhi in terms of the brutality of the rape and how that had resulted in the person's death. But there was a direct link between how the media had covered the rape and murder in Delhi, and that spurred the framing of how the media covered the rape and murder of Anine Boyson. And so that became the initial spark that kind of caught in terms of the media's imagination and how the public started to frame it. And then what happened was, as is typical with murders of women, in fact, murders of most people when they're not famous celebrities, is that after a couple of days, media coverage of Anine Booysen's death started to tail off and started to decline. But a week after her death, or a little over more than a week after her death, Riva Steenkamp was killed. And Riva was the opposite of Anine Booysen in terms of stature, social stature. She was blonde, she was very attractive, she was well educated, she came from a very coherent, loving family, she was a celebrity, she was involved in a romantic relationship with a celebrity. And Riva's death suddenly got a huge amount of coverage. And what happened at that point was people said, well, hold on, why are we covering Riva so much and we're not covering Anine? And so what I track in my chapter is how the rape and murder of Josie Singh in Delhi in 2012 sparked initial coverage of the rape and murder of Anine Booysen in South Africa, giving it coverage that it wouldn't otherwise have had. And then the subsequent murder of Riva Steenkamp in the same month as the killing of Anine Booysen was what allowed the media coverage of Anine's death to continue. And how these three very different, really, killings of women all interacted with each other on a media platform to amplify media coverage, particularly of a sort of not the least noticeable victim by all other metrics. And what this does is it describes areas of divergence and convergence in terms of media coverage and how they can play a different role. And this becomes important when we start looking at later issues of Me Too. How does Me Too how does a movement catch fire? How does it capture the imagination? How do media stories, sometimes from multiple different countries, drive and give momentum to a movement? And I think what I really conclude is that in many cases, it's individual stories that are what allow a movement to actually capture the imagination. And when we sort of make it a mass movement, people can't individualize it. And then there's less of a sort of relationship with that. So it's incredibly important for those of us who want to study how does a movement happen, is to look at what are the individual stories that almost gave it traction along the way. I'm going to stop there because there's lots more to talk about. There was something else I wanted to add, but I didn't write it down, so it's no longer in my brain. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brodie. It was great to get some insight into especially like stories that and rapes and murders that happened at such a long time ago that we have like kind of left our collective consciousness, and it's important to be reminded of that and how it has really informed the Me Too moment. So yeah, I want to move on to introducing Jamil. His pronouns are he, they, them. They're a scholar, researcher, and author. Their book chapter is Reflection, Gay Boys Don't Cry When We're Raped, Queer Shame and Secrecy. Jamil is a scholar, researcher, and author, as I said. They are currently enrolled for a PhD in critical diversity studies at WITS. Their work explores multiple axes of difference, including race, gender, and sexuality, and class. Their work aims to contribute an archive of lives and experiences that are often not recognized or acknowledged. Their publications include contributions to titles by Kwela, Polity Press, and Mistral, while also publishing in academic journals such as Agenda and Sexualities. Their socio-political memoir, Kamr, The Makings of Badr Slums, I think, has been awarded the 2021 Humanities and Social Sciences Award for Best Biography, as well as the 2021 University of Johannesburg Debut Prize for South African Writing in English. They have also been newly selected as an artist in residence at the University of Johannesburg, forming a part of the first cohort of the program, working on literary offerings about platonic queer love. So I'd like to hand over to Jamil, who will talk us through his piece and share some insights.
Thank you, Uvania. I must be honest, and I think there's something I have to say. Listening to Nechama speak, and obviously, we engage with these topics and these concepts, yes, from a scholarly perspective and also theoretically, but it is also extremely personal. and listening to Nechama speak about everything that she spoke about, I must say it's actually impacted me a little bit. And then also just the realizations dawned on me that I'm going to talk about this very personal experience out loud for the first time. Because writing it and putting it in a book for people to read far away from you is a different experience from actually saying it. And so, yeah, for my own sake, I thought I had to acknowledge that. So I was approached by Nicky actually to contribute to this book, and she said to me that included in the book, the editors would like to include also stories about Me Too moments and sexual violence and assault that actually speak to the experiences of men and boys. And it's actually quite interesting that when I was writing the piece, it was at the time when I was coming to terms with my own identification as being non-binary, and no longer understanding myself as someone who is a man. But then writing a story from the perspective of a boy, you know, who was, and as I was socialized as a boy and a man. And so as Uvania has also noted, I wrote a memoir, and what I write about in the book is something that fits into the timeline of the memoir, but I didn't include it because it wasn't something that I could find the strength to actually record at the time. But by the time Nicky asked me to do this, and then I thought about, but what would I say? You know, it just became obvious to me that there was this one story that you never told. And so actually, what I'd like to do, I think everybody would be okay with that, is just read an excerpt before then talking about, you know, what it is that I was trying to do with this chapter. Okay, so I will start at the beginning and end somewhere in the middle. All right. So, bodies like mine were never meant to be cared for. They are always to be advertised, yet perpetually hidden. People like me are a warning, warding off wayward, intrusive thoughts of freedom. Pleasure is not meant for us to have. It is taken from us. I was raped when I was 9. A childhood friend a few years older than me did it. He was one of 2 older neighborhood boys I started exploring my body with. Until then, our fascination with our erections led us as far as touching and feeling the shame and condemnation building up in our penises at the most inopportune times. We liked the sensations, however premature they were to us. On the day I was raped, the weather was wonderful. It was the height of summer in Cape Town on the South African coast, and I had invited my friend around for a swim. As always, we touched and played with each other under the water, incorporating our little explorations into the rules of our make-believe games. When we had enough of swimming, we would lay our towels down on the hot paving and lay on our bellies to dry in the sun. Eventually, the sun always got too hot for us and we would seek out shade. Although there was ample shade along the boundary walls enclosing the pool, he insisted that we go to the other side of the house where the garage wall and the neighbor's boundary wall made a concealed alleyway. He told me to stand facing the wall with my hands up. I was not allowed to see what he was doing behind me. He pulled my shorts down and gently penetrated me. The shade suddenly seemed too much, with me still not allowed to see what was being done to me. I did not make a sound. I didn't say a word. It was nothing like what we are told rape is. Nobody fought, nobody cried, nothing was sore. In fact, it felt nice. To even consider that I had been violated would have demanded many impossible explanations from me regarding it and the fact that I liked how it felt. That I was supposed to give permission for it to happen was a thought I had never encountered before. If anything, The worst thing that happened that day was that 2 boys had done what is reserved for men and women at best, and teenage boys and girls at worst. My shame had not come from the violation, but from the sexual affirmation of my queerness. So what I had tried to contend with in this chapter was the idea of rape as something that is not always violent, something that does not always lead to death. And, you know, as I say that, I think about what Nechama just said earlier about how there's the choice that is given. You know, it's worse to be raped than to die, so choose which one. And sometimes neither of, or sometimes the experience of having something done without your consent, something done to you without your consent, the horror and the violence of it actually escapes you until you are later able to find the vocabulary to describe what has happened to you. And so I think about how a lot of, and again, you know, the high profile media cases and not so high profile media cases, but, you know, like we always say, everybody knows, almost everybody knows somebody who was raped, but if you ask around the room, nobody has ever raped anyone. And I think about then how when you just talk to people in general, right? There's often for something to be considered a rape or sexual assault or violation, it has to have been like unimaginably violent, something that, you know, has completely just obliterated somebody's personhood. And for me to be, I mean, like I said, I was 9 with very little knowledge of what that means and how that happens. But for me, the bigger concern was, how do I explain that I'm playing with boys, you know? And so there's also for me this juxtaposition of right and wrong, and then almost a choice again of what the shameful act is. And so that intersection for me between the shame and the secrecy that exists around queerness, also then bleeding into the shame and the secrecy around having to take responsibility for being violated, because that's also, I believe, quite a universal experience for victims of sexual assault, is that one internalizes the shame and the responsibility for having had your consent violated. And then of course, I mean, you know, there's also the issue of sexuality and childhood sexuality, that in the absence of knowledge, of understanding, of agency, and actually the understanding of agency, what that means, how one executes it, that one is entitled to it. The way in which all of those, you know, social phenomena are shrouded in shame and secrecy, one doesn't actually then get to see, you know, to see the consequences of consent being violated, and how that then bleeds into every interaction that one makes in your life, right? If you cannot understand that your body is your own, that you have to give consent to for certain to participate in certain activities, how that then impacts on your ability to understand that you have consent in general, whether it be for that one has to, for, I don't know, your work to be referenced. You have to give consent for, I don't know, so many ways in which that lack of understanding in the first place of the fact that one is entitled to consent charts a trajectory for one's life to constantly be a person who is violated. And it's one of and none of that is by chance. It is a deliberate orchestration of making women, queer people, femme people almost oblivious to their own rights over their body, and then making sure that oblivion opens the gate for a lifetime of violation over lifetimes. And you sit and you internalize and you live with the shame of it and don't speak about it. So that was the other thing for me, right? Is that I had an opportunity once before to publicly make it known, and I couldn't take it. Also, interestingly for me, a big deterrent to including this story in my memoir was the fact that the events in that book existed alongside my interactions with my family and other people in my community and friends and all of those things. And I almost felt a responsibility not to expose them to that. You see, again, taking on responsibility that isn't actually mine to bear. And so what I really wanted to do with this chapter was to try and complicate the idea of violation, assault, rape as something that is always this really, really violent thing. And then also to chart to paint a picture of how like I said, the deliberately orchestrated lack of understanding around consent creates environments for people to be violated over lifetimes, and in fact possibly get to the end of their lives and never know that is what was happening to them, and also never see the people doing these things as violators, and I think a lot of us know that from grandmothers and great-grandmothers who have experienced unimaginable violence and cannot bring themselves, for example, to say, yes, that person did it, and that person is an abuser, in fact, the opposite, and I think it's important for us to see how we are set up to support the constant, even if it happens to us, the constant dismissal of violence against us, against people around us, and in fact then to become like Mona Al-Tahawi says, foot soldiers of the patriarchy, where we in fact become the fuel that maintains the system that keeps violating us. And so I think with at the end of the chapter, I talk about the ability to one's coming to terms with and understanding and gaining the vocabulary to actually identify that one has been violated. It opens a very small window because it's an extremely difficult thing to do. And even so for me, even though like I described, my experience was not violent, but it leaves one, when you actually do come to the realization of what has happened, it leaves one very much in a state of limbo, because within the discourses around Me Too, one feels kind of like, okay, but how does my story fit in? Because it doesn't fit this kind of, the narrative of violent people doing this to victims of sexual assault, right? But I think once one gets to the central understanding of what consent is and how it works and why it is important, it finally opens a little window to, in the softest voice, be able to say, me too.
Thank you so much, Jamil. This piece just resonated with me so strongly because of my own experiences as a survivor from being assaulted in my childhood. And it really gave me the language that I didn't have before to engage with myself about what I'd experienced. Because in the same way, there was no explicit violence, even though it was violence in these experiences. And sometimes, I would feel guilty for claiming survivorship because there was no inherent violence experienced in these assaults. But the more this piece really liberated me in a way and made me feel like I also can claim Me Too in the same way other people do. And I just want, when I read the book, initially I thought, why did you end with this piece? Like, why didn't you start with this piece, And after being more reflexive about it, I realized it was like, if we ended with the theorizing and the cerebral nature of what we do around this work, I think it would have been less impactful because, that kind of theorizing that predicates all of this, and that we ended with something that was so powerful, that was so visceral, that was so physical at the level of the body, at the level of the psyche. And to me it was just such an effective way to really pull together everything that came before and reminds us of what we're talking about and the complexity around SGBV, around claiming survivorship, around Me Too, around how that kind of manifests. So yeah, just on a personal level, that was very special to me. And I think it created, when we theorize as academics, there's some distance between ourselves and our readers, but ending on Jamil's piece, it created proximity to victimhood and survivorship. And it also it reminded us who these victims are and that it's us as well. So thank you for sharing, for reading out a bit of your excerpt. I think that was a great one, especially for those of us who haven't been able to read your piece. And I just want to thank Shilpa, Nechama, Nicky, Jamil again for your insights, for being so vulnerable and opening up to us. We are a bunch of strangers ultimately, but I know a lot of us are looking forward to engaging with the book and really beyond, just the academic side of it, just sitting with it a bit and being reflexive about how this informs our lives, what our experiences have been, and how to tie that into, it's given us the launch pad and the language we need to move forward in understanding SGBV and movement work and stuff. So thank you so much. I wanted to just kick off with one question and then I'll open it up to the floor. So what I got from this book, and that I think was emphasized quite a bit, was that that just subscribing to the Me Too movement as it was centered in the UK, the US, the global North, was limiting, and my question is, how do we balance or navigate participation and ascribing to such resistant movements such as Me Too, that has been a formidable moment, while also realizing that there are limitations and there is a lack of diversity and complexity, because the global South and the global North have very, very different experiences and understandings and knowledges. So that we too resist, redefine, redirect. I think that's something I've been struggling with, is when to intercede and be like, you know what, actually we need to redirect, we need to rethink. We cannot just buy into this wholeheartedly because we believe in the movement. So that's my only question. And anyone who's open to answering, that would be great.
I'll do a small start, but because this is an important thing to discuss, because one of the positions I take in my work on femicide, which it's not controversial, but I know it's not, everyone doesn't like it, is I often question the rhetoric of social movements, right? So, and we've had this discussion before in other situations, is it can galvanize action, but when we all jump onto a hashtag, for example, and hashtag activism, does it get anything? What does it achieve? And my challenge there is always, if we just jump on a bandwagon, particularly when it's one that's shaped by the global North, even though we know that Me Too didn't emerge, necessarily from, that it had a kind of a deeper origin to Me Too itself. So it has value because it creates a frame that people can interact within, that they maybe weren't aware existed before. There is also this weird thing that I think we should all just acknowledge, which is when it comes from America or England, it must be okay. So if the hashtag is like European, then it must be like the Gucci of hashtags, instead of like the fake polo, the fake Ralph Lauren that we have here or whatever. So we are always looking for that affirmation in terms of movements. But I think it's a challenge. It's like, and I'm not clear what the answer is, because they have value, like popular movements and movements themselves have value, but then what backs them up to sustain them, right? So we have, if you think of what happened to Me Too now, movements move into the next one. So the time of Me Too has passed and we have something else now. And so in the South African context, we might have had Am I Next? And again, these often tend to hook from individual stories, and then people get galvanized for like 3 weeks, and then it moves further back down, the list of headlines and stuff. You look at the gang rape case in South Africa right now. I don't understand why this isn't like the biggest story in the world, sort of thing, because of its obscenity. I can tell you why it's not. It's because, well, the victims weren't white, I'm presuming, and they weren't middle class, even though some of them were apparently models. And I don't know. So it's like there are factors within there that block that story, which is beyond comprehension, right? It's just beyond comprehension. Like acts like that happen outside of a state of war are just like, literally, they blow my mind. And I've spent the last 10 years studying how women and men get murdered, and that still blows my mind. So let's look at the only part. What is the popular march we're seeing now? The ANC is marching against foreigners and against gender-based violence. I mean, it's like, so I think there's a lot of questions around the initial momentum that we see within like protest, and then how does that sustain over time? I don't have the answers, but it concerns me that we tend to emphasize the protest tomorrow instead of the achieve results next month sort of thing.
I'd also like to make a contribution. And so, what I thought about when you asked your question was this expectation of, resistance movements to have this pristine kind of unity that is a marker of its legitimacy. And nowhere in the world, unless, of course, those in the movement cause that's being fought for are that homogenous, that they wouldn't have those contestations. But I absolutely despise the idea of the fact that because we are working towards a common goal, that we should agree about everything, and that we should not contradict each other or call each other out. I mean, you know, I think about, for example, and this has happened in the Me Too movement, contestations around race, contestations around, you know, location, all of those things, right? But I think about, for example, with queer liberation movements, right? And the contestations around transness, also the pushback from Black, Indigenous, and queer people of color against white gay men who are flagrantly racist, but want queer liberation, for example. And so then for us to push back against that and say, no, we don't agree and we don't stand with you, is fracturing the movement and therefore sort of impacting on its power. But that in itself, that idea that we need to display, like I said, this pristine kind of unity, is an idea that is planted there by power, and it is deliberately disseminated as a discourse and a narrative that tries to sort of douse the fire of the movement. And so I think the way in which we at least try to work with that is to say it out loud, because if we simply just, you know, we have these contestations and then the response is, you're not, you know, your cause is illegitimate because you're not unified, and we simply just accept that, then we concede. But I think it's important for us to have these conversations and say, no, this is why I do not agree with you. This is why, yes, you and I are fighting for the same cause, but what you are doing is equally oppressive. It's introducing a dynamic of you know, a power dynamic that then disadvantages me. And put it out there in public. We do not need to feel compelled to you know, take each other around the corner and be like, hey, so I just wanted to say, before we go out there in front of the man again, don't say this, don't do that. No, it's absolutely all right to disagree and contest in full view of everyone, to point out the complexities of the matter, to point out the complexities of the movement. None of that will ever diminish the legitimacy of the cause.
Can I jump in and add some? Do you want to speak?
Please.
You wanted after you if you want to say something.
No, I just wanted to say thanks so much, but like, please do, because I think it is such a big question and something that I've been trying to, as I've been reading, trying to figure out, like, how do we balance this? How do we navigate it? So, please go ahead.
So just adding really to the sort of the contextualizing and the complexity that Nechama and Jamil sort of articulated about sort of hashtags. And since we're talking about Me Too, specifically Me Too on social media, because that's where much of it played out, and really some of the questions that were asked even during the workshop, and you'll hear them in the volume as well, is who gets heard, how is it framed, right? And who is it addressed to, but what are the outcomes? So for instance, one of the things I talk about in my paper is that here we had this list that was put up of sort of men academics who had who students were accusing of sexual harassment. But what happened was that the conversation then became between feminists, and sort of there were various, so what happened was that sort of the men accused of sexual harassment somehow moved out of the frame, right? The other thing I was thinking of, and this is precisely one of the things that we were trying to address in the workshop and the book, is that from where do we hear? And Nechama also pointed to this, right? That we often tend to hear from global North context, from North America and Western Europe. That's the news that travels. That's the news that gets reported not just in their context, but also in ours. So, for instance, South Korea had a fairly complex Me Too going on, but that was certainly not reported in India, and I imagine it was not reported in South Africa either. And as Nechama was saying, that in many ways hashtags have a short life, but if we look at Me Too, even as it has a short life, our book is not the only book on it, right? There are other books that have been talking about hashtag Me Too, and this moment on social media has had a complex and diverse and rich afterlife, both in scholarship and in activism. And I certainly see that the discourse around Me Too has transformed the ways in which corporations, at least, are compelled to engage with sexual harassment. So certainly in India, we are seeing more and more companies that at least are paying lip service to having committees that address questions of sexual harassment. How this plays out, of course, is anybody's guess. I think it's not likely to play out in very, very progressive ways. But the fact is that more and more companies feel that in order to buttress their credentials as modern, as ethical, as progressive organizations, hashtag Me Too has compelled them to take cognizance, at least. And so something about that mainstream discourse has shifted. So even as we critique this, and it certainly, there is a lot to critique about it, I think the afterlife of it demonstrates that it has made a difference.
Thank you so much. I think, yeah, it's a big thing. It's a big question, and I think we'll keep having to grapple with it in any movement and continue to do so, even with this, Me Too, men are trash. I've experienced that a lot in Men Are Trash. So yeah, if anybody else would like to speak to that question, otherwise I'll move on to, oh yes, Nicky, go ahead.
I mean, maybe just one thing to say about kind of hashtag activism and the hashtagging of activism in general, like the way that we perceive activism to have changed as a consequence of the rise of social media. Well, two things. Firstly, in the context that we are talking about, it is important to acknowledge that not everyone's on Twitter. Right, we're talking about a very, very, very small percentage of the population in a country like South Africa, where sexual violence aimed at poor Black women is absolutely endemic, and very few of these women are online in this way. The scholarly and critical attention paid to these hashtags can actually, in some ways, almost be problematic, because it's like we're talking to ourselves. We're talking to people like us who already are having these conversations. Another thing that I think is important to acknowledge is the way in which a hashtag or a kind of activism that emerges online is so easily co-optable by precisely the forces that we would want to not co-opt it. And, I think the example for me that springs to mind is the kind of general transgender panic, the moral panic around trans people being predators and mentally ill. And, we're all aware of this lunacy that is spreading globally, that is becoming a kind of a far-right folk devil that's standing in for all these other imagined threats to the sanctity of society. And what has happened there is that a whole lot of women who define themselves as being feminist have now found themselves, because they took this on, have now found themselves standing neck to neck with like really, really severely misogynistic, queerphobic, intensely violent white supremacists around the world who are like, yeah, we're also supporting women's rights. We're also, hashtag this, hashtag that. And it's like, this is what happens. This is what can happen if your activism becomes simplified into something that transmits itself so easily, right? So as is the case with most things, it is more complicated than that, and it is something that we need to, I think, be very wary of. And, as Shilpa says, these things do travel in really interesting ways, and they do often have lives beyond the lives that we expect them to have. Sometimes those lives are completely unexpected, and sometimes those lives do exactly the opposite of what we would hope some sort of self-proclaimed feminism would do. So, we need to be, particularly for people like me who are, super interested in the media. I mean, I think everyone on this panel is super interested in the media and how the media works. we need to really avoid the potential pitfall of thinking, A, that what we see on social media speaks for everyone, and B, that things do not lend themselves to really dramatic morphings and mutations and thefts and co-optations and inversions on social media, because this does seem to be happening quite a lot.
I think what's interesting was I had an interview with Trump's campaign manager, where he said that it's so easy to exploit the liberals, the progressives, the ones who want to be inclusive, because there's divisiveness within us. And so because they can just can rally to any cause. And it made me think, but at the same time, like what Jamil said about, it doesn't matter what they're necessarily going to do. We still have an imperative and responsibility within our own movements to call each other out and to question certain things and not just accept the rhetoric and the narrative. So I wanted to move on. I don't know if Lasiba is still in the room, but I know that you had a question. Okay, cool. Go ahead.
I'm back. My name is working very well, so I'll just switch off the camera, if that is okay. Okay, so I just want to make 3 quick points. Thank you for the insightful nature in which the book is being launched, very insightful. So recently in the media, in the wake of the rape that took place in Krugersdorp in South Africa, the rape of the 8 women, the Minister of Police said, actually, one of the women, the Minister of Police said that the 19-year-old woman who was part of the women who were raped is actually lucky for having been raped by one person. So I just want to refer back to the framing of gender-based violence by government officials. So it looks like we also need to engage government officials as part of stakeholder grouping in how they should address issues of gender-based violence. So the issue of intersectionality also comes into place, you know. So I'm just thinking about how the media covers the incident, the rape incident of a woman who is Black, poor, unemployed, and lives in a rural area. You know, would the rape of such a woman, would the coverage, you know, be the same as that of a middle-class white woman? So also, since I grew up in Limpopo, as a man, I grew up in a culture where, for example, the elders would rape or sexually violate young girls, and then we would be told not to divulge in the interest of protecting the rapists, you know, because the idea was that we need to protect the family name. So some of us men have got unresolved issues. We know things that happened in the past, and it looks like the truth will never come out because nobody wants to talk about the uncle who sexually violated boys and girls, you know, because of, so there is really the issue of cultural beliefs and stereotypes. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Lasiba. Is there anything that you would like answered, or is it just, are you opening that thought up to the floor?
Yeah, so maybe the issue of, so 2 things. How do we engage government officials or politicians like the Minister of Police, you know, so that when they give narratives, they don't in a way perpetuate gender-based stereotypes? And also, as men, how do we play a role in changing the narratives? Especially, you know, like myself, I said, I know so many sexual violations because of patriarchy and because of you need to protect the family name. As a man, what role can I play in building and creating a gender-free, a society free from gender-based violence? Yeah.
Yeah, Nicky, go ahead.
I mean, I don't have answers for any of those questions. The question of how we engage police and government figures, I mean, these people know, they just don't care. You know, this stuff, the material is out there, the information is out there. It's just not, it's not important enough for someone like our Minister of Police to really give a shit. I think, you know, you talk about what men can do, and that, again, I don't have an answer for this, but the story that you tell, you know, this very traumatic thing of growing up in a community and being aware of sexual violence and sexual assault, and not being allowed to say anything about it because of protecting the family name. You know, these boys are boys who then grow up learning that this is normal, that this is okay. And as much as, you know, Jamil mentioned Mona Al-Tahawi, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. And, you know, the way that she talks about women as certain types of women as handmaids of the patriarchy, we can say the same things about boys, but they are interpolated into this position, right? We are raising boys in this country in a way in which we teach them very, very early on that your role is to support a violent patriarchy. If you do not support the violent patriarchy, you then become its object. You become the object of its violence. You put yourself at risk. So it's not as simple as going, oh, you know, men are bad or men are bad. There's amazing scholarly work being done by people like Kopano Rotele and Malose Langa on Black masculinities in South Africa and how they have become the way that they become. And you know what this suggests to me is that we are socially, all of us, this is a structural problem. We are socially responsible for the way in which, of course, we raise girls to accept the kinds of violations that happen in our communities as something that is unavoidable. But we also raise boys to know that if they step out of line, they will also be violently attacked and punished by the patriarchy. And that's actually important for us to acknowledge. I think we shy away from considering, because so much violence that happens in this country is a consequence of patriarchy and is a consequence of the way masculinity has gone terribly wrong, we shy away from really talking about the fact that patriarchy, excuse my language, but it fucks men up, right? Patriarchy, toxic masculinity in South Africa are really, really, really messing with the life choices, the effective experiences of a lot of men. Our feminism needs to include empathy. You know, our approach to GBV needs to include empathy. It needs to include empathy. And as much as there is a hell of a lot of monstrousness involved here, we also need to consider where people come from. What is it that will turn a bunch of people into a group of gang rapists, right? What is going on in their lives? How did this happen? We can't just say, that's what men are like. That's what men do. Because coded within that assumption is a fundamental racism. And we need to avoid that as well. So, you know, I think I don't have any answers for you, but I think that we need to be having conversations in this country about early childhood education, about parental education. We need to be considering childhood poverty. We need to be considering nutrition and malnutrition, all of these basic issues that impact on how we raise children. That, you know, you raise children in violent situations, you end up with violent adults. So, you know, I can imagine that it would be hugely distressing to be a young boy or a man who is aware of these kinds of things, and to be the person who then takes the step outside that patriarchal system and goes, right, I'm finally going to speak up. You are taking a huge personal risk. If you are bold enough to do that, that is hugely important. If you are not bold enough to do that and you don't want to take that personal risk, possibly the best thing that you could do is make damn sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, and stop that kind of responsibilization happening to young boys in your family, right? End the cycle.
Uvania, can I just say 3 things? One, I just want to start just a point harkening back to the previous topic about hashtag activism, right, and online activism. Say we have to find a way to make it work, because we must not forget about the fact that social media activism and hashtag activism has been extremely useful for people with disabilities who cannot get out of their homes to go and walk in a march, or, you know, do things that most able-bodied people can do when one thinks about what a protest is, right? So I think definitely need to find a way to make sure that that kind of activism has a space and a place that we can all participate in, that there can be some kind of hybrid between different forms of protest that sort of complement each other. But not that that's what was being done here, but I think it's so important that we never dismiss accessibility as a reason why social media has been very important to allow different kinds of people with different kinds of abilities to participate in protest and also just be heard. You know, that's the other thing about social media is it's your account. You can say whatever the hell you want on it. Well, until Twitter decides that you have violated the codes and stuff, but nevertheless, until that happens, you know, you have very, very much in control of your voice. And I think that's important. And then the second thing that I wanted to say was that I think it's, you know, Lisiba pointed out, it contextualized his experience very specifically, like in Limpopo, and saying that, you know, this is a cultural thing. And as much as what I would, you know, I understand why that's being said. I think it's important for us to remember that this thing about protecting the family name and not speaking out against the abuse of uncle, it's happening in Kensington Palace, it's happening in New York, it's happening in Sydney. It's a global culture of patriarchy. It is not a specific thing to Black South African communities, for example. And within that conversation is also then the question of how Black South African communities have become so deeply affected by this form of patriarchy. How did it get here? When did it get here? Because these things don't happen in isolation. And we cannot have these conversations in isolation from apartheid. We cannot have it in isolation from colonialism, and how all of those systems have impacted the construction of different kinds of masculinities, and why certain kinds of men then have, in some ways, had to adopt a hegemonic kind of masculinity. And it is now then understood as culture. And then the third thing that I wanted to say was just to Nicky's point about young boys being punished by patriarchy. You know, I think about Bell Hooks' writing, where she talks about how, you know, the first encounter of a little boy with understanding the demands that patriarchy makes of him is firstly to be punished for displaying what is really human characteristics, displaying emotional vulnerability, displaying affection, displaying, you know, the ability to respond to pain, to cry about it, right? So the first job of patriarchy is to remind a little boy that if he gives in to what is really just human emotion, he will be punished for it. And I mean, in so doing, like she says, it's a system of psychological terrorism. And we have to, I absolutely agree with Nicky. We have to understand that violent men were once little boys who were violently punished out of humanity. And so we have to ask questions about, and again, I don't know what the answer is, but we have to ask questions around when we look at that trajectory of how a little boy becomes that violent man. We have to pay attention to all the things that have happened in between, because I think that is where the answers are.
Thanks, Nicky. Thanks,
I want to
Jamil.
jump.
Yes, sure, go ahead.
Another point, because what Jamil said is just so critical to how we conceptualize this. And it's kind of, I was going to say a bunch of other things, but I really want to hook onto that point, because I always say we don't have a femicide problem, we have a female homicide problem within a much bigger homicide problem. So 85% of murder victims or more in South Africa are Black men. And we don't write about them. We don't talk about them. They are just like, well, that's what happens when you're a man. It's just, that's what men, and particularly that's what Black men do to each other, is they're just violent to each other. And we don't research it. There's no granularity. There's no individual person that's there. And I see this kind of across the board from the States. So when Nasiba asked first about engaging with the ministries, I have had the fortune or misfortune to be invited to work with a number of departments to try and explain things to them. And, I do find that they're aware of information, but they're also not. And because they're often politicians in a sense, they tend to trade more in rhetoric than in really trying to understand the problem. So they are content to be seen to be tackling the problem rather than actually tackling the problem. And what we have, and I think in India, it reflects in a very different way, because again, if we look at violence against men, we don't talk about it in the same way. We have less understanding of the people who are the main victims and perpetrators of violence. And what we also, can conceive about, and this is why scholarship from the Global South is so important, because we have commonalities there that don't exist in other countries in the same way. When I look at, and I always feel bad, but it's like my Scandinavian colleagues, and they have like 9 murders a year, right? We have that many women murdered in 26 hours, in South Africa. So it just, the framework is just completely different. So first of all, this collegiality between regions is the most significant platform that we could have to actually engage in. And when I say scholarship, I don't only mean academic, right? Like on every level, because there's so many things there. But in both India and South Africa, we have different iterations of what people often describe as cultures of violence, which do hinge very much around ideas of masculinity as they connect to ideas of violence. And in the South African context, because I'm more familiar with that scholarship there, we also need to remind ourselves that not only are people raised within a framework of violence, but violence is quite productive. In the South African context, you always think, oh, violence is a terrible thing, but violence really is a very effective means to an end for many people. And so without assigning a value to it, and I think that maybe we can reconceptualize to some extent, what is violence in our context, in the same way that, Jamil asked that very almost gentle, brutal question of how one experiences violence when it's not violent. And it's such a, there are so many nuances here that we need to consider. And we also need to understand that violence is not always destructive, that in our context, very much, violence is actually an exceptionally productive process. And this relates back to how we label violence, particularly when it's committed by Black and brown men, because I think that's where a lot of the words that we use and the framework that we're familiar with comes from that origin. So yeah, but what, that question of why we don't look at the men, and I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about female victims or victims, but we really have to start to do this in parallel, because we are missing so much important information there.
Thank you. I just also wanted to jump on there and say that something that I had to come to terms with, a concept, which is that men and boys are the first victims of patriarchy, and their victimhood is what leads to women and girls being victimized. So yeah, thank you so much for all those responses. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to that, or we can move to the next question. Okay, I don't see any hands up, but if anybody in the room would like to say something, please let me know.
Ask us a question. Oh, yeah.
Go ahead, Jamil. Do you want to ask a question?
No, I was saying, where's Jamie? I'm saying she must ask us a question.
I'm sure she's here.
I can ask a question.
Thank you.
I actually have many questions I could ask, but also in an effort not to take up too much time. My question is if one of the editors could maybe speak to the visual imagery on the cover of the book. I don't know if folks in the audience saw the poster, which actually had, there we go, Nicky has it. So it has the hands and there's a needle kind of threading through one palm. And I was just, I'm always curious about the process behind, choosing imagery that can speak to such, as everyone has said, complex, sensitive topics. How do you kind of distill that into one image? So I don't know if any of you can speak to that.
Unfortunately, the person who could speak to that is not here.
Oh, no.
The image is from an Indian artist who I believe Srila knows personally. Am I right? She found and selected it. We did have some disagreements. I think. Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, it popped up and it was very powerful because it suggested, kind of, that horrible Freudian idea of how knitting and weaving are kind of feminine forms of art, because it's actually about women sealing up their embarrassing vaginas, because we've all got these, we're all suffering from endless penis envy. I remember like my head exploding when I read this as a master's student, like, oh, I see. But there is something in that, the kind of the intimacy of this type of craft that is usually dismissed as being feminized in some way, but also that it's an act of self-harm and an act of self-healing at the same time. That was why I liked that image, that it spoke to, that it suggested a kind of physical agency in repairing the damage that's been done to you in a way that might also, hurt. But, this was my response to an image that was suggested by someone else. Shilpa, I don't know if you have any comments on it.
No. Anybody? Oh, let's see by your hands up. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks. So one of the men in my province who's married, he's older, he's like 69. In our culture, the elderly, they don't share with younger men what they are going through. So he's married, and he has been telling me that he has a challenge with the wife who doesn't want to be intimate anymore. So this is also in keeping with the book titled Intimacy and Injury. So he told me that, so what he does when the wife doesn't want to be intimate with him, he emotionally abuses him, and for him, it is acceptable. And he has been abusing the woman for, not physically, but emotionally and verbally for the past 3 years. So I'm not sure in the book whether you cover such issues where the sexual violence the verbal violence also is in the homes, is in the private. It is out of public view, and it is subjected to most women or some women who are powerless and they don't have agency. So yeah, how do we empower such women, especially if they are already at an advanced age, you know, and they can't divorce the men because it's like we already have 6 children, you know, so till death do us part. So they would also argue, and the woman is a Christian, you know, she would argue that what God has bound together, let no man separate. You know, all those arguments. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. I think that was a comment. I'm not sure if Siba wanted a response. Yeah, so I don't know if there are any other questions. I think I have so many questions, so I think I'm going to just jump in, seeing as no one's hands are raised. So this is specifically to do with Nechama's piece about media coverage and different victims. I was wondering, you know, what you thought, you know, this was happening like 2012, 2013 with Jyoti and Anin, and you know, we see this shift with Uyinene in terms of like social media and the presence of technology. So I was wondering whether you think that there would have been a difference had these women, especially Anin, been murdered post Me Too, and what social media, like what influence that would have had if there would have been a shift in terms of the way she was positioned, or, you know, whether that would have just translated in the same way. I'm not sure if I'm being very clear about the question, but just kind of the role of social media in that.
I'm going to sound quite old now, as in I'm closer to 50 than any other age, is that there was social media in 2013. We were on Facebook, my dear, and on Twitter. And so I think that, and already quite a lot of South Africans were using social media at that time. I don't think it was necessarily, I don't think hashtags were that common at that period in time. And obviously consumption of print media was larger because it fell off even before COVID. But we have seen a decline in consumption of formal print media consistently, not just in South Africa, but in many other countries. And I think that, honestly, Uyinene, I know people want to think that that was a shift, but it wasn't. I hate to tell you this, but next year, and probably still this year, because we've still got, what, 5 more months left of this year, 4 more months, so I can't add any more, or 5 if we include this month, but I can almost guarantee you that we're going to have another hashtag woman victim before the end of the year who's prominent and who we think is going to, you know, change the way the government thinks about something, and people maybe will go on a protest march somewhere, and if she's young enough and if she's like pretty enough and if she was promising enough as a student, especially if she was a student and she had a life ahead of her, then we're absolutely going to see that again. And what we see is, so this is again the importance of when we take a long view of things, is I can tell you every year almost who were the big cases. So I can tell you the 4 or 5 names every year that we learned them by their first name. So and every year we have those. So in every country there are those mega cases. So every year we have whoever it is for that year. And this year there will be new women. And there will be women where there won't really be men. There won't be any men who we will be including in that. Maybe there'll be a child, depending on the case. So what we have to ask ourselves, frankly, and I say this within the media as well as someone studying the media, is what does it shift? So maybe it's about how we ask questions of, it's not that it doesn't do anything. Media coverage of these things and social media interaction does achieve something. But I think that we're not always honest with ourselves about what it achieves. And maybe that's also why the scholarship of this is really important, and why books like this are so critically important, because they allow us to step back a little bit from something like a Me Too and to say, well, what was this? And if we reassess the same thing in 20 years' time, we'll come up with different answers again. But I think it's really important that we are critical about ourselves, about interaction. And as Jamil was saying, that we allow for multiple versions and disagreements about what is or isn't achieved. But as scholars, is that maybe we are less convinced of our own hypotheses on what is or isn't happening. Or even as activists, if there's anyone who's in the session who considers themselves an activist rather than a scholar or a journalist or whatever it is we sometimes need to step back and consider what is actually being shifted there. I'm not sure that social media has resulted in anything shifting, but it's resulted in many things shifting, but not necessarily policy, not necessarily policing, and not necessarily the minds of men or even women who are embedded in sort of patriarchal frames. I mean, social media is certainly like J.K. Rowling, you know, I mean, so and it's kind of like counterintuitive, because as humans, and especially as we love studying things. So we see like, oh my God, you're on the internet, you have all the information available to you in the whole world, and that's the version you chose to go with. Like, wow, you have to really be, you know, pretty lazy almost to not entertain other knowledge. So yeah, maybe I would say we need more questions around this, and questions around who are these names, questions around those intersections between social media activism and shifting. Like what does it provoke in social spaces, online spaces, real spaces, activism spaces. So if anybody's thinking of doing a master's or a PhD, you know.
I think my question was less about like shifts in terms of like the socio-political landscape, but shifts in terms of the way social media is used to galvanize movement work. So, because I certainly think that there are shifts, whether that translates into policy changes. So I respectfully disagree with that. But I think that the difference was that we were using social media differently in 2012. And we had different social media platforms that reached different audiences and worked in different ways. So the difference then, I would say, like, and this, my research reflected this, was that back then there was more focus on connecting with friends and family, maybe sharing some breaking news. Whereas now there is this inherent political framework where people have really taken up movement work. And there have been substantive ways in which it's been done, where there's just visual activism. But for me, the question was more about how social media, whether social media now post Me Too, not 2012, like that difference in the way that maybe Anine specifically, because we had a lot of stuff about Riva, particularly on Twitter, but how she would be positioned differently, whether she'd be given a different voice, a different, a different sense of humanity, of visibility. Because for me, I think there would be a difference to some extent than the way it happened then, because there is more pushback. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't result tangibly, but yeah, that my question was more
the coverage of Anine. There were at least 700 different articles about her, so there was quite a large voice just in the news media, and so I think don't assume that there wasn't something that happened there just because it had a slightly different iteration. What we didn't have in 2012, 2013 was WhatsApp, which obviously is a different sort of shift. I think Nicky.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I actually don't, this is not a comment. I actually have to leave this session at exactly 4 because I have to go take over childcare. So, thinking about, feminist modes of work. Thank you all so much for attending, and thank you for hosting, and Uvania, thank you for being amazing.
You're mute, you're mute.
Muted yourself.
Oh, have I? Okay, I was just saying I have to leave.
okay. Nicky,
yeah,
thank you so much.
take over childcare right now, so I'm terribly sorry to leave in the middle of something so fantastic. But thank you to WiCDS for hosting us, and to Uvania for facilitating this fantastic conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much for being here and sharing with us. I think Jamie would also like to. Okay, she's gone. But yeah, I think Jamie might want to. Yeah, we're hitting 4 soon. If there isn't anything anyone else would, feels is imperative to say right now before we clock out. Any other questions, comments by anybody here? Okay, so I just wanted to say thank you so much to our speakers for being here today, for making themselves available just on so many levels, because we know that this work isn't just academic work, it's emotional, psychological work. It's at the level of the psyche and the body. And your insights have been so powerful. And this book is truly, I believe, a benchmark for Global South feminist theorizing in terms of SGBV and movement work and queerness and all these different intersections. It's also, another way to look at different Global South feminist approaches and feminist futures. In that, in reading it, I really felt like this book was written by us, with us, and for us. And going forward, I think I'm going to think more about the divergences between India and South Africa in terms of what the lens of African feminism in relation to this work and post-Me Too and SGBV and stuff. But yeah, that's just from me. Thank you so much. It was amazing to talk to all of you whose work I've read extensively and, referenced in my own work. And I would like to hand over to Jamie to close us out.
Great. Thank you so much, Uvania, and everyone, Nicky, Shilpa, Nechama, and Jamil. Yeah, I mean, I think it was just such a insightful, powerful conversation to be a witness to and to be part of. So thank you so much to all of you for sharing. You've made it entirely appealing to find this book, and hopefully at a cheaper price, and to read it and to cite it. And yeah, and I also just want to say that we have been recording this, and I think that not only for folks who weren't here for this, that we can also use this as a resource to come back to. There were so many, I have 2 pages of notes. There were too many gems for me to even highlight right now. So I know that I will definitely be referencing what y'all have said and shared. And yeah, on behalf of WiCDS, just thank you so much for allowing us to also be a part of this book and a part of this process. We feel very honored that we got to do this with you. And I'm also just leaving feeling very in the strength of solidarity with other people, with feminists, with queer folks. And it's just, yeah, very empowering to hear y'all, to feel seen and heard and reflected in both your writing and words. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and reflections in the chat and being here with us today. And hopefully we will see some of you at future WiCDS events, WiCDS Wednesdays. We have a conference coming up in October. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to our panelists and our audience members. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
And thanks to Jamie also for doing all the admin and the stuff in the background that's tedious and difficult. So yeah, thanks guys.
Thank you so much,
you.
everyone. It's such a pleasure to have been here.
And thank you, Jamil and Shilpa. Lovely to be with all of you.
Likewise, thank you.
Everyone.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.